It's hard to think of Middle-earth without thinking of dwarves. They are of equal import to the story of the Lord of the Rings as are elves, men, and hobbits, but unlike elves and men, the dwarves are not counted among the children of Ilúvatar, or at least not officially. Eru Ilúvatar called them the children of my adoption, while the elves and men were known as his children of choice. A strange turn of words, that, and one might also think that dwarves were not important in the grand scope of the world of Middle-earth, but what story would be complete without hairy bearded women? Am I right? The dwarves were originally created by Mahal, also known as Aulë, the smith. Aulë created the seven fathers of the dwarves, from whom all other dwarves are descended, deep within an unknown mountain, somewhere in the heart of Middle-earth, during the period known as the Sleep of Yavanna. This is when Middle-earth was dark and silent, and monsters from Utumno roamed the landscape for as far as the eye could see, making it an extremely dangerous place. And because of this, Aulë made his children strong and durable, able to endure hardships that lesser races would not be able to survive, because he needed them to be able to make up for what the others were given by Eru as part of their natural heritage. But given that he had nothing more than a vague impression of the children of Ilúvatar, his creations were structured quite a bit differently than the beautiful elves or men, being shorter and stunted and lacking in the fairness that the other children were granted. And let's not forget beards, because beards are an important aspect of dwarves, and yes, this includes female dwarves. And given that he also didn't have the divine power of Ilúvatar to grant independent life to any creation, his dwarven children were bound to his will, which is really important in the scope of the creation story, because anytime his mind was distracted with something else, his creations would fall lifeless at his feet, nothing more than meat puppets, golems without any animating force of their own. And it's also worth noting that Aulë conceived his children in secret because he was impatient for the arising of the children of Ilúvatar and wanted to have his own children, something to love and instruct and hold to his bosom and guide throughout the realm. Unfortunately for Aulë, Ilúvatar discovered this and came to reprimand him when he found out. And Aulë at this point was like, "Look, Dad, I really want to create my own things, my own creatures, my own children," but he did realize that he had done something that was a little outside of the bounds of what he'd been created to do, and in repentance agreed to end their lives. But something weird happened here, because when he lifted up his hammer to destroy the dwarves, they cowered and begged for mercy, because it turns out that Eru had taken pity on them and decided that they were indeed worthy of true life like all of his other creations. And he decided here that he wanted to include them in his plan for Arda. But there were some stipulations here, because he didn't want them to wake before the elves, because in his grand vision for the world and the universe, he intended the elves to be the firstborn of all the children. So while he was willing to give Aulë's dwarven children life, he bound Aulë to an oath. You gotta put them to sleep in chambers beneath the mountains, and they're only allowed to come forth into consciousness after the awakening of the elves. These adopted children of Ilúvatar had a troubled history like many of Tolkien's creations. The legendarium has various incarnations of the seven fathers of the dwarves, depending on which book you read. In one version, the seven fathers were laid to rest together in the same chamber they were constructed in, while in later versions they were laid to rest in different mountains of the world in pairs, with only Durin I rising alone. In the earliest versions of Tolkien's Middle-earth mythology, the dwarves were actually evil beings created by Melkor, and in another version of the legendarium, it's hinted that the dwarves didn't even know about Ilúvatar, or at the very least disbelieved his existence, but then later writings contradicted that suggestion, and we go round and around and around because Tolkien was constantly changing his mind and rewriting the lore of his world. In addition, the reference to Durin the First being all by his little lonesome has been interpreted by some as referring to the fact that in the oldest versions of the story, Durin was the only one that didn't have a female companion. This is actually a reference that was made by Tolkien to the 13 dwarves that existed in one of the drafts, which was Durin in 6 pairs, but later on it kind of got whittled down to Durin the First being laid to rest alone, while the other dwarven fathers were laid to rest as 3 different pairs. It's worth noting that in that same draft, Tolkien considered that there were potentially other dwarves made that were put to sleep beside the fathers. But again, Durin would be the exception, as he created his folk by gathering dwarves from other clans during his wandering and bringing them under his banner and eventually into the formation of his first kingdom. Meanwhile, if you go read the Lost Tales, you're actually going to find that there were only 2 groups of dwarves mentioned, the Nauglath of Nogrod under their king Nagladur, and the Indrafangs, the Longbeards of Belegast under their king Bodrith. They lived in the south of Artenor, also known as Doriath. It's, in short, a very confusing thing. It's really very confusing to be a dwarf in Middle-earth because their history seems to be a muddled mess when it comes to their true origins, but that kind of matches what it's like for all the other races of Tolkien's Middle-earth because there are so many drafts that happened over the course of the creation of this. It's also worth noting that in The Lord of the Rings, Gimli makes a statement that the dwarves aided in the making of Thranduil's halls, but in the Unfinished Tales, it's actually stated that Thranduil's halls were not to be compared with Menegroth. He had not the arts, nor the wealth, nor the aid of the dwarves, so there seems to be further contradictions when it comes to the origin stories of the dwarves beyond just their inception. Be that as it may, it is generally considered canon that Aulë laid the 7 fathers of the dwarves to rest in various places throughout Middle-earth. The eldest of them, Durin the First, laid alone at Mount Gundabad in the north of the Misty Mountains. He would then go on to found the line of dwarves known as the Longbeards, who were the dwarves who were the most commonly known to readers of the books. They were also the ones most friendly to elves and men, commonly referred to as Durin's folk. They lived in the city of Khazad-dûm. It's these dwarves that I said most readers of The Lord of the Rings, or people who have seen Peter Jackson's films, are familiar with. And of all the fathers of the dwarves, only Durin, as I mentioned earlier, is said to have lain alone, which is interesting because he didn't actually father a line so much as gathered a line of people. 2 of the other dwarven fathers were laid to rest in the Ered Luin Blue Mountains, and they founded the lines of the Broadbeams and the Firebeards, who later lived in Nogrod and Belegast. The last 4 fathers of the dwarves were laid to rest in 2 pairs in Rhûn, far to the east of Mount Gundabad, indeed pretty much as far away to the east as the Blue Mountains themselves were in the opposite direction, which ensured that the dwarves would propagate across the entirety of Middle-earth in their various forms in all sorts of different locations. These other fathers founded the lines of dwarves known as the Ironfists, the Stiffbeards, the Blacklocks, and the Stonefoots, or if you want to get technical about it, the Stone Feet. I don't know if they're actually called the Stone Feet. It's also an interesting little sort of side note that it is said that the 7 fathers would return to life after generations among their own folk, but that didn't really necessarily mean reincarnation, but rather that the bodies of the fathers would be preserved and their spirits would eventually return to said bodies and live again in another lifetime. It is said that Durin the First was known to return to life 6 more times across the totality of his existence. Very strange, and in their own way, sort of an immortality similar to what the elves had. While the exact timeline is unknown, sometime after the elves had first awakened, the 7 fathers of the dwarves came into consciousness and were released from their stone chambers where they had been laid to rest for so many years, and they first awoke to the light of Middle-earth. The first, being Durin the First, wandered for years, gathering people to him until he eventually founded the city of Khazad-dûm in the caves beneath the mighty peaks known as Barazinbar, Zirikzigul, and Bundushathur. This city became populated by the Longbeards, who, as we mentioned earlier, became known as Durin's folk, and they prospered immensely under Durin I's rule, which ironically was so long that he became known as Durin the Deathless, which is a pretty cool title in the grand scope of dwarves because being known as the Deathless is kind of terrifying if you're going up against that person in battle, and if you're serving under someone who's known as the Deathless, kind of makes you proud to think of having a leader that's potent. Meanwhile, far to the west of Khazad-dûm, in Ered, Luin, and the Blue Mountains, the great dwarven cities of Belagast and Nogrod were founded during the Years of the Trees, which is quite a bit before the elves ever actually arrived in Beleriand. Now, these dwarves, the dwarves of Belagast, were known, among other things, as being the first to forge chainmail armor, and they also dealt with weapons and traded various weapons with the Sinda, which it makes them sort of a warmongering dwarven tribe, but it's all cool in the scope of dwarven history. And if you go back to the Lord of the Rings line by Gimli that we talked about earlier, these were the dwarves that carved the 1,000 caves of Menegroth for Thingol, who was the lord of Beleriand. And at the same time in Nogrod, the mighty smith Telkar forged Narsil and Angrist, a pair of weapons that would go down in history as two of the most important weapons. For those of you who have read The Hobbit and Lord of the Rings, they also created the famed dragon helm of Dorlomin, which in the grand scope of things makes them pretty awesome smiths overall. Probably how they got their long rumored reputation as being the best smiths in the realm. Now, there's also these other dwarves that were found in the Far East, and they had fallen under shadow and were considered to be of evil mind when the ancestors of the Edain first encountered them. But it's worth noting that these dwarves, who were known as the petty dwarves, were not actually part of the seven families, but were actually like outcasts and misfits and criminals who had been cast out from the various dwarven societies and formed their own little band and fell into shadow, essentially. Now, they were so nasty that they were actually hunted by the elves during the First Age for all their evil deeds. You basically didn't want to be known as a petty dwarf. That was not a cool thing. Now, there's a lot more to be said about the history of the dwarves of Middle-earth, and I'm going to be doing that in a follow-up video where we're going to be talking about what were the dwarves up to throughout the First, Second, and Third Ages. So if you want to get that update, don't forget to like, subscribe, and hit the bell icon here so that you always get the latest Middle-earth content from my channel. And don't forget to support with a membership, a super thanks, or a super chat on live streams and premieres, and also check out the Patreon page, and I'll see everybody in the next episode. Until then, happy wandering in Middle-earth.